Hello, welcome to Joy Talk number 3 on this bright and cold November morning. This will be the last one for 2020. We'll pick the theme up again in 2021 in January, but from next week we're into December, so we'll be thinking particularly about Christmas and looking forward to that story, the story of Christmas. So this is our third talk. Joy, living your best life, holding nothing back. You remember the first one, we talked particularly about leaving the past and having the courage to embrace the new. And we thought about the character from what we call the New Testament, Zacchaeus, who had a complete life change when he met Jesus. And we also started our look at Elisha. And remember that when he was called, he then burnt his plough and roasted his oxen and left nothing for him to come back to if he was tempted to do that. And with our second session, we thought about particularly not settling for less or stopping short, stopping before we've done everything that we are hoping to do in our lives. And again, we thought about Elisha. We thought about him at the end of his life being called before the king and saying to the king, you need to hit those arrows on the ground, and the king stopped short. And then we thought about a character from what we call the New Testament, which was Bartimaeus, who refused to stay in his old lifestyle and asked Jesus for a complete change to get his sight back and start his life anew. So today we're particularly thinking of the theme of refusing to stay behind, and hopefully you might have caught sight of our children's story for this week, because this would have been our special. And our children's story is the story of Ruth. And Ruth was someone who refused to stay behind when her mother-in-law was leaving the country they'd been living in and going back home with nothing. Ruth refused to leave her, even though Naomi said, I'm getting old, you'll have to look after me, I can't find you another husband, you're going to live the rest of your life on your own and taking care of an old lady. Why would you want to come? But Ruth said, no, I'm going to be with you. I'm refusing to stay behind. And I was reflecting on this. I was thinking of an amazing thing that happened to our middle son, Andy, a couple of years ago. He's a great football fan. And 2 years ago, he was on holiday with some friends in France. And it was while the World Cup was going on, and another friend of theirs who worked on a sports channel suddenly got in touch with them and said, look, I've got a couple of spare tickets for the semi-final of the World Cup. Do you want to come? And so they waited to see if England got through the quarterfinals, and they did. And then they had a couple of days just to sort out how to get themselves from the south of France to Moscow. Oh my goodness, talk about refusing to stay behind. So they did a lot of research. They found out they needed to catch a plane from Paris. So they had to move the two families, the children and the dog, to a campsite near to Paris, because where they were staying was 524 kilometers away from Paris. And then they had to catch flights from Paris. So basically on the day the semi-finals was happening, the boys drove 6 hours to get the families settled in to where they were going to be staying, in a little caravan just outside Paris. They got an hour's sleep. They then drove to Paris airport. They caught the first of many flights. I think the next one was from Rome. They ended up in Moscow. They had to do a train ride and a taxi and a walk, and eventually they got to the stadium and got their tickets and watched the match, which, if any of you are football fans will know, was a bit of a disappointment. And then they needed to get back straight away because the Eurostar to bring all the families home was going in a day's time. They were leaving from another airport in Moscow. They had to use Google Translate to find out where they needed to be and when they needed to be there. And it was a couple of flights then. They got to Paris. They then had to drive, get themselves on the Eurostar, and then reunite with their families on the other side of the channel. What an amazing story of determination to do something, to refuse to stay behind. Andy says, All in all, by the time we got back home, we'd driven thousands of miles, been on 5 planes, 2 taxis and 2 trains. Dave and I were awake for nearly 3 days with no real sleep or wash. Was it worth it? Yes. It was an amazing experience with some very close friends, and the whole atmosphere and enormity of the sporting event I will never likely to get to witness in my lifetime again. So that just shows you, if you really, really want something, what you are prepared to do in order to achieve that. And that brings us to the question, what about us? How often do we find ourselves saying, oh, I wish I'd done that? Or maybe, I wish I'd done that differently. Or maybe, how come things like that never happen for me? And do we find ourselves living in this constant state of regret? And do we need to find ourselves a new guiding principle? For example, we could have this statement, I refuse to stay behind. Or we could say, I'm not going to watch life happen. Or I refuse just to be in the audience. Life is not meant for observation. But we need to make that choice to refuse to stay behind. We need to stop waiting for someone to call us off the bench into the game, to use a football analogy. Here's another one, to refuse to stay on the sidelines anymore and grab hold of life and refuse to let go. I'm really fascinated by the word volunteer. Because we use that a lot in Storm, but it actually means someone who chooses to step forward and say, I can do that, let me do that, can I volunteer to do that? Which brings us to Elisha again, and he's studied with Elijah for quite a while since he left his plough and his oxen and went into this new life of learning to be the prophet for God's people. And Elijah says to him, actually, my time is coming to an end and I am going to be going, and this job will now be yours. The training period is done and you need to step forward into the role. And he says goodbye to Elisha, but Elisha says, I'm not prepared to stay behind. I'm going to go with you all the way, even to the end. And so the first place they get to is a place called Bethel. And Elijah says to him again, look, here's a company of prophets. You can stay with them. Let me go on my own, because I am going and it is time for you to take on this role. And Elisha says, no, I'm not going to stay here. And Bethel could be, for some of us who've been around church things quite a while, a place of worship where we think, I'm just going to stay here in this place where it's safe and I can worship God and nothing more is required of me. But Elisha says, no, I'm going to keep going. So they travel on together and they get to a place called Jericho. And here again, there's another school of prophets. And Elijah says to Elisha, look, you can stay here, stay with these prophets. Let me go on my own, because it is time for me to go and it's time for you to take this job on. But Elisha says, no, I'm going to stay with you all the way right to the end. So like the story of Ruth. And Jericho, we might say, that's a bit of a place of battle. We remember the story of God's people walking around the walls of Jericho and blowing their trumpets and banging their drums until the walls fell down. And some of us, I think, maybe do stay here. We're still battling and wrestling with God and we can't quite move on from that place. But Elisha says, no, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to refuse to stay behind. I'm going to go with you all the way. So then they get to the last place, which is called Jordan. And Jordan obviously is a river, those of you who've been around the stories of God for a while, that you will have heard of. And it's a place of belief. It's a place of baptism. It's a place of life change. And again, it's possible to stay here in that kind of history of what's happened in our lives. But again, Elijah says, do you want to stay? And Elisha says, no, this is a great experience, but I want to go all the way with you. I'm refusing to stay behind. So Elijah strikes the water with his cloak and they walk through the Jordan on the dry land. And then Elijah turns to Elisha and says, well, what is it you want? Because I'm about to go. And Elisha says, well, I want a double portion of your spirit. And that takes me back to a personal story. So double portion of God's Spirit doesn't necessarily mean you'll do double the amount of things that someone else has done. It just means having more of God. Many, many years ago, when we had just started up a group called the Singing Servants, which became Storm, and we were doing bits of street performances with the children, particularly singing, as the name would tell you, the Singing Servants. We would go onto the streets and sing some songs and do some dramas, and I would speak. And the church we were part of at the time, which was Elim Worthing, were meeting in Zion School, big hall, and we were doing a bit of an event where we were showcasing all the different things that were going on in the church, and TSS, the Singing Servants, was one of them. And a famous man was coming to speak that day. Some of you may have heard of him. It's called Jeff Lucas. He's written lots of books and he's quite a famous preacher and a hero of mine. Anyway, so we were showcasing what we were doing. So we sang a song and then I preached, and I'll never forget it because one of our famous songs at the time was This Little Light of Mine, and we had some children, very young children, on the front row singing away. 4 little boys who were aged sort of between 3 and 4, who in the middle of this performance all pulled their little trousers down and examined their willies and looked at each other's in the middle of singing This Little Light of Mine, which caused great amusement in the audience, of course. And then I had to say a word, and after I'd spoken, and it was just after Princess Diana had died, and all that astonishing collection of flowers were gathering outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, and that feels quite relevant at the moment for those of you who are watching The Queen, the new series of The Queen. And I spoke about that and the prophecy that had been given that this would happen, that flowers would be left in all our major cities. And at the end of it, Jeff Lucas got up and came over to me and said, "Oh, I'm going to pray over you. I'm going to pray that you have a double portion of God's Spirit on you," which was a little bit shocking to me and everyone else. But I kind of took from that God had something on my life to do with speaking, which is why I'm still doing it now and wondering where it will take me. But that's what happened for Elisha. He said, "I'll have a double portion, thank you very much." And then he saw that amazing scene of Elijah being taken up on a chariot into heaven. So Elisha had many, many opportunities to opt out. And I have to say, that's probably true of my own life, that we've had, since that experience of Jeff Lucas praying over me, we've been through some really tricky times in Storm, as we are now, in our church, as it was, in our personal lives. That's a whole other story, but those of you who will have travelled with us during that time will know there's been some really, really difficult times, and each time, and getting older as well, there's been moments where I thought, is this the moment? Do we just stop? But it just felt like it so far has not felt like the right time. And I always think about when Jesus said, "It is finished," and he was hanging on the cross and he was basically saying, "I've done everything the Father required me to do." Now, he hadn't done everything. There was lots still to be done. He hadn't healed everybody. He hadn't spoken throughout the world. He'd stayed in one very small country, one tiny little corner, but he'd done everything that God had asked him to do. And I feel like we need to know that. We need to refuse to stop, refuse to stay behind if there's still more that God is asking us to do. And God gives us the choice. He gives us the choice whether we will stay in a place of worship or stay battling things through with God, or stay in those places where we've known amazing changes in our lives through baptism or whatever that might be. But is God still saying to us, look, step forward, volunteer? So I have some questions, and they're questions for me and for you too. And this is what I will finish with. If we are not where we want to be, why do we keep choosing to stay there? If we are not where we want to be, why do we keep choosing to stay there? If we know that there's a future waiting for us. Why are we choosing to stay trapped in the past? And what will it take to jar us out of our present security into an uncertain future? Well, this is a good reflection for now, because everything is uncertain and we have the choice to stay worrying about what we've lost or grab hold of what is in the future, refusing to stay behind. Remember that little chap Oliver, please sir, can I have some more? May that be our prayer as we look forward to this Advent and Christmas time and the new year and whatever that might bring, that we will refuse to stay behind but push into that future, knowing that God has gone before us and will watch our backs and will travel the journey with us. God bless you, and see you next time for a bit of Christmas. Goodbye.